Warsaw, 1943. The streets smell of ash and fear. A city carved into fragments by barbed wire and SS checkpoints. In the Jewish ghetto, children no longer play in courtyards. They crouch in cellars, hide behind false walls, learn to move like shadows through spaces adults cannot fit. But one child, an 11-year-old boy whose name would be deliberately erased from most history books, was learning something else entirely. He was learning that the German shepherd dogs patrolling the ghetto walls had a weakness, a simple, ordinary weakness that could turn the Nazis' most feared weapon against them. This boy discovered that common black pepper, the kind his grandmother once used in her kitchen before the deportations began, could render these trained killers completely useless. And in the winter of 1943, he would use this knowledge to help smuggle dozens of Jewish children out from under the noses of the SS guards, who believed their canine units made escape impossible. Before the walls went up in 1940, Warsaw was a city where Jewish and Polish families lived side by side, where children attended schools together, where the smell of fresh bread drifted from bakeries on Saturday mornings. The Jewish quarter was vibrant, overcrowded perhaps, but alive with the sound of Yiddish conversations, street vendors haggling over prices, children chasing each other between market stalls, families gathered for Shabbat dinners in cramped apartments, and despite the poverty many faced, there was dignity in the struggle, community in the survival. Then the Germans came, and within months, everything that made Warsaw recognizable was systematically dismantled. The Nazis erected a wall 10 ft high around the Jewish district, compressing over 400,000 people into an area of just 3 square miles. What was once a neighborhood became a cage, and what was once life became a countdown to death. The boy, whose real identity we'll protect by calling him Jacob, lived with his mother and younger sister in a third-floor apartment that now housed 3 other families. His father had disappeared during the initial roundups in 1941, taken to Treblinka on a cattle car that never returned. Jacob's mother worked in a German uniform factory inside the ghetto, her hands moving mechanically over fabric, while her mind calculated their odds of survival week by week, day by day. She was 34 years old, but looked 50, her eyes hollowed by constant hunger, her body shrinking inside clothes that once fit perfectly. Jakob watched her diminish, watched his 6-year-old sister's ribs begin to show through her dress, and felt something harden inside his chest. Not hatred exactly, though that was there too. It was something colder, more focused. It was the understanding that waiting for rescue meant waiting to die, and that if they were going to survive, it would be because he found a way to make it happen. The ghetto operated under a logic designed to ensure maximum death with minimum German effort. Food rations were calculated to provide exactly 1,184 calories per day, precisely enough to starve a population slowly while keeping them functional enough for forced labor. Children were particularly vulnerable, their growing bodies unable to sustain themselves on watery soup and moldy bread. Disease spread through the overcrowded buildings like fire through dry timber, typhus, tuberculosis, dysentery. Bodies appeared in doorways each morning, wrapped in newspapers because there was no longer enough fabric to spare for the dead. The SS guards walked the perimeter with their dogs, German shepherds trained to attack on command, to tear flesh from bone, to track the scent of anyone attempting to escape through the sewers or over the walls. These dogs were the Nazis' insurance policy, their guarantee that even if a prisoner somehow breached the physical barriers, they would not make it far. Jakob first noticed the dog's behavior during a routine inspection of his building. The SS brought their animals through the apartments randomly, searching for hidden food, weapons, or people. On this particular morning, a guard's dog began sniffing near the kitchen area where Jakob's mother had been grinding what little spices remained into the daily soup. The animal suddenly sneezed violently, backing away from the counter with its head shaking, eyes streaming. The guard cursed, yanked the leash, assumed the dog had encountered some vermin. But Jacob watched carefully, his mind working through what he had just witnessed. Later that night, he experimented with a tiny amount of black pepper near a stray cat. And when the animal reacted similarly, sneezing and retreating, an idea began to form in his mind. An idea so simple it seemed impossible that no one had thought of it before. Break eye. December of 1942, the deportations from the Warsaw Ghetto to Treblinka had slowed, but not stopped. The Nazis were methodical in their extermination, taking thousands at a time, leaving just enough people alive to maintain the illusion of a functioning work camp. Underground resistance networks had begun forming. Groups dedicated not to armed uprising, which everyone knew was suicide, but to smuggling children out of the ghetto through connections with sympathetic Polish families on the outside. These networks operated through the sewers, through gaps in the wall created by bribed guards, through tunnels dug over months of dangerous labor. But every route was patrolled by dogs, and every escape attempt was a race against those trained noses that could detect human scent through concrete and steel. Jakob approached one of these resistance members, a teenager named Marek, who worked in the smuggling operation, and told him about the pepper. Marek listened, skeptical, but desperate enough to consider anything. Within days, Jakob would be given his first test. The test came on a frozen January morning when the temperature dropped to -15°C, and the ghetto streets turned to sheets of black ice. Marek brought Jakob to a basement beneath a burned-out pharmacy, where the resistance stored their meager supplies. 3 other members waited there, their faces showing the same mixture of desperation and doubt that defined every decision made inside the walls. They had located a drainage tunnel that led beneath the ghetto boundary, emerging in a cemetery on the Aryan side where a Polish contact waited to receive children. The problem was a new SS patrol route established just 3 days earlier, with 2 guards and a German shepherd, making rounds every 20 minutes precisely. The dog had already detected 2 previous escape attempts, resulting in 9 executions in the ghetto square as punishment. Marek explained this to Jakob in a flat voice, then asked if he truly believed his pepper idea could work against an animal trained specifically to hunt human beings. Jakob's hands trembled as he pulled out a small cloth pouch containing perhaps 2 tablespoons of black pepper, salvaged from a dozen different apartments where families had given up their last pinches of spice for this experiment. He explained his theory in the way only a child who has been forced to think like an adult can, speaking with a precision that made the older resistance members uncomfortable. The pepper would not stop the dog from smelling, he said, but it would overwhelm the animal's olfactory system temporarily, causing such intense irritation that the dog would be unable to focus on tracking human scent. The effect would last perhaps 10 to 15 minutes, long enough for children to move through the tunnel and reach the cemetery. But the pepper had to be deployed correctly. It needed to be thrown directly into the dog's path at the exact moment the animal began tracking, creating a cloud that the dog would inhale before understanding the danger. 1 chance, 1 moment. If Jakob's timing was wrong, if the wind shifted, if the dog avoided the cloud, everyone involved would die. They decided to attempt the escape that night with 4 children, the youngest being Jakob's own sister, who was selected because the Polish family on the outside had specifically requested a girl under 7 years old. Jakob argued against including her, knowing that if the plan failed, he would watch his sister be shot or sent to Treblinka. His mother made the decision for him, her voice carrying a finality that allowed no argument. She told Jakob that his sister had 2 weeks left before her body would shut down from malnutrition, that the rash spreading across her skin was the early stage of typhus, that this was not a choice between safety and danger, but between a quick death and a slow one. She pressed the child into Jakob's arms in their apartment and left for her factory shift without looking back, because looking back would have broken something inside her that still needed to remain intact. The tunnel entrance was hidden beneath a false floor in the pharmacy basement, a hole barely wide enough for an adult to squeeze through, dropping 6 FT into a sewer line that ran for 200 YD before connecting to the drainage system. The smell was overwhelming. Human waste mixed with chemical runoff from the factories, and the water level varied depending on recent rainfall. Tonight, it was low, only ankle deep, which meant faster movement, but also louder splashing that could alert the guards above. Jakob went first, carrying his sister on his back, her thin arms wrapped around his neck, her breathing rapid against his ear. Behind them came 2 other children, a 9-year-old boy named David, whose parents had been taken the previous month, and a 13-year-old girl named Esther, who had survived a selection at the Umlagplatz by hiding under corpses for 6 hours. Mar followed at the rear, carrying a makeshift knife and a prayer he did not believe in anymore. They moved through the darkness, guided only by touch. Jakob's free hand trailing along the slime-covered wall, counting his steps to estimate distance. The tunnel amplified every sound, turning their breathing into gasps, their footsteps into thunder. Above them, the city continued its occupied existence. Polish families eating dinner, German officers drinking in commandeered apartments, and somewhere on the street directly overhead, an SS guard walked his patrol route with a dog trained to detect exactly what was moving beneath the frozen ground. Jakob reached the exit point, a metal grate that could be lifted from below, and stopped. He could hear the guard's boots crunching through ice, could hear the dog's panting, could hear his own heartbeat hammering against his ribs. He reached into his coat and gripped the pepper pouch, his 11-year-old fingers steadying themselves for a moment that would determine whether 4 children lived or died. The timing had to be perfect, and perfect meant understanding the rhythm of the patrol in a way that went beyond simple observation. Jakob had spent 3 nights watching from a crack in the pharmacy wall, documenting the guard's pattern with a precision that surprised even Marek. The SS soldier was methodical. German efficiency applied to the task of preventing escape. He walked 47 steps from the corner checkpoint, paused for exactly 12 seconds, while the dog investigated a specific section of wall where previous tunnels had been discovered, then continued another 30 steps before turning back. The vulnerable moment came during that 12-second pause when the guard's attention focused on lighting a cigarette, a habit so ingrained he performed it at the exact same location every rotation. In those 12 seconds, the dog was given slack on its leash to investigate independently. And in those 12 seconds, Jacob would have to lift the grate, deploy the pepper, and get 4 children through the opening before the guard's match went out. Marek had argued for a different approach, suggesting they wait for a shift change or a moment when the patrol was distracted by activity elsewhere in the ghetto. But Jacob understood something the older resistance members did not. There would always be reasons to wait, always be justifications for delay. And delay meant watching his sister's body continue its shutdown, meant watching the typhus rash spread further across her skin, meant accepting that caution was just another word for surrender. He insisted they move tonight, and something in his voice, some quality that transcended his 11 years, convinced them. Perhaps it was the steadiness of his hands as he checked the pepper pouch one final time, or perhaps it was simply that everyone in the resistance had reached a point where the difference between bravery and exhaustion had become impossible to distinguish. The guard's boots grew louder overhead, and Jacob counted the steps in his mind, matching them against the pattern he had memorized. 41, 42, 43. His sister's breathing changed against his neck, becoming faster, more panicked, and he whispered to her in Yiddish that she needed to stay absolutely silent, that the game they were playing required perfect stillness. She nodded against his shoulder, and he felt the dampness of her tears soaking through his coat. 46-47. The boots stopped. Jakob heard the rustle of the guard's coat, the strike of a match, and then the metallic clink as the dog's leash was given slack. This was the moment he pushed up on the grate with both hands, felt it resist, pushed harder, felt it begin to lift. The rusted metal scraped against concrete with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the winter silence. And for one terrible second, Jakob was certain the guard had heard, certain this would end with bullets and screams, but the dog began sniffing along the wall, its attention focused in the opposite direction, and Jakob threw the pepper, not scattered randomly, but in a concentrated burst aimed at the exact point where the animal would pass in approximately 3 seconds based on its established pattern. The black powder hung in the frozen air like a small cloud, nearly invisible in the darkness, and the German shepherd walked directly into it. The reaction was immediate and devastating to the animal's composure. The dog's head snapped back, its body convulsing with violent sneezes, and it began pouring at its face with both front legs, whining in confusion and pain. The guard cursed, yanked the leash, assumed something in the wall had released irritating dust or chemicals. He pulled the dog away from the area, trying to calm the animal, and in that moment of distraction, Jakob lifted his sister through the great opening. She emerged into the cemetery behind a row of headstones, exactly where Marich's contact had promised to be waiting. A woman's hands reached out of the shadows, grabbed the child, and pulled her into darkness. David came next, squirming through the narrow opening with the desperate speed of someone who understood this was his only chance at life. Then Esther, moving with the eerie calm of someone who had already survived the unsurvivable and no longer feared death. The guard's cigarette was nearly finished, perhaps 4 seconds remaining before he would resume his patrol, and the dog would regain its senses. Jakob pulled himself halfway through the grate, felt Marek pushing from below, felt the winter air hit his face like a slap. The pepper had worked. The simple, impossible plan had actually worked. 4 children had just escaped from the Warsaw Ghetto using nothing more than a household spice, and the courage of an 11-year-old boy who refused to watch his sister die. The success of that first escape spread through the resistance network within hours, whispered in basements, and passed between factory workers during their brief meal breaks. Jakob became something unexpected in a place where hope had been systematically exterminated. He became proof that the machinery of Nazi control had vulnerabilities, that an 11-year-old could identify a weakness the SS had never considered. Marek brought him to a meeting of the resistance leadership. 9 men and women who operated from a hidden room beneath a textile workshop, their faces showing the cautious optimism of people who had learned that every victory carried the seeds of a larger disaster. They questioned Jakob extensively about the pepper technique, about timing, about quantities needed, about whether the effect could be replicated. He answered with the same unsettling precision he had shown before, explaining that different dogs might have different sensitivities, that humidity and wind would affect the pepper cloud's concentration, that they would need to experiment and adapt with each escape attempt. The resistance had been smuggling children sporadically since late 1942. Managing perhaps 2 or 3 successful escapes per month through various routes, each one requiring weeks of planning and enormous risk. The Catholic orphanages and convents on the Aryan side had agreed to shelter Jewish children, but only if those children could be delivered safely. Only if the escapes did not attract SS attention that would endanger the Polish families involved. Jakob's pepper method changed the mathematics of possibility. It meant the sewer route, previously considered too dangerous because of the dog patrols, could potentially be used multiple times per week. It meant children who were days away from starvation or disease could be moved immediately rather than added to waiting lists that had become death sentences. The resistance leadership made a decision that night. They would use Jakob's technique as often as possible, extracting as many children as they could before the Nazis adapted their security measures. Over the next 6 weeks, Jacob participated in 11 more escape operations, each one following the same terrifying pattern. Wait in the tunnel with children who were often too weak to walk properly. Count the guard's footsteps overhead. Time the grate opening to the exact second the cigarette was lit. Throw the pepper with a precision that improved with each attempt. He learned to read the wind direction by feeling the air movement in the tunnel. Learned to adjust the pepper quantity based on the dog's size and breed. Learned to move with a speed that seemed impossible for someone carrying children on his back. The resistance members began calling him the Pepper Boy, a nickname he hated because it made the work sound like a game rather than the life and death calculation it actually was. But the name stuck, and soon even the children waiting for escape would ask if the Pepper Boy was leading their group, as if his presence guaranteed survival. Not every escape succeeded. On the 4th attempt, a guard deviated from his patrol pattern, arriving at the checkpoint 18 seconds early, and Jakob had to abort the operation with 3 children still waiting in the tunnel. They tried again the following night, but one of the children, a 7-year-old boy named Samuel, panicked during the climb, and began crying loudly enough that Marek had to cover his mouth and pull him back down. The delay meant they missed the timing window, and all 5 people spent 4 hours cramped in the freezing tunnel, listening to patrols overhead, waiting for a second opportunity that never came. They returned to the ghetto before dawn, and Samuel was taken by his family to a different resistance cell, assigned to a different escape route. Jakob never learned if the boy survived, and that not knowing became another weight he carried alongside all the others. The pepper supply became a critical resource, more valuable in some ways than food or medicine, because it represented possibility, rather than mere survival. Jacob's mother contributed her entire remaining stash, as did dozens of other families once they understood what the spice could accomplish. The resistance established a pepper collection system with members visiting apartments and asking for donations, explaining in whispers that black pepper could save children's lives. Most families gave everything they had, even knowing they would never taste seasoned food again. Even knowing the pepper represented one of the last connections to their lives before the ghetto. An elderly woman named Mrs. Kaminka donated a jar containing perhaps a 4 cup of pepper she had saved from her restaurant, which had been seized by the Germans in 1940. She pressed it into Jakob's hands and told him her own grandchildren had already been taken to Treblinka. But perhaps this pepper could save someone else's grandchildren. Perhaps something good could still come from what she had managed to preserve. By March of 1943, Jacob had helped smuggle 47 children out of the Warsaw Ghetto, a number he tracked by making tiny marks on the wall beside his sleeping space, each mark representing a life that might survive the war. But the success brought attention, the kind of attention that proved fatal in occupied Warsaw. The SS began investigating the pattern of children disappearing from specific apartment blocks, noticing that families near the burned pharmacy were reporting losses at unusual rates. German efficiency, the same quality that made their war machine so devastating, now focused on identifying the leak in their containment system. They brought in specialists from Berlin, men trained in counter-resistance operations, men who understood that insurgent activity followed patterns that could be mapped and predicted. These specialists studied the patrol routes, interviewed guards about unusual incidents, and began documenting every moment when the dogs had behaved strangely during their rounds. The resistance received warnings from sympathetic Polish policemen who still maintained some humanity, despite their collaboration with the occupation. The SS was closing in, tightening security around the cemetery exit point, adding random patrols that disrupted the timing Jakob had relied upon. Merrick argued they needed to stop operations immediately, let the attention fade, find new routes and new methods. But Jacob looked at the list of children waiting for extraction. 63 names representing 63 families who had surrendered their pepper and their hope to the possibility of escape. And he refused, not refused with anger or drama, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had calculated the odds and accepted them. He told Marique that every day they waited meant more children would die from disease or be selected for deportation. That the Nazis would eventually discover the route, whether they used it or not. That stopping now meant abandoning children who were counting on the Pepper Boy to save them. The compromise they reached was brutal in its pragmatism. They would attempt 3 more escapes, moving 15 children total, and then permanently seal the tunnel to prevent the SS from using it to infiltrate the ghetto. Jakob would lead all 3 operations personally, compressing into 1 week what normally would have taken a month, accepting the exponentially increased risk because the alternative was unacceptable. His mother learned of the plan and tried to forbid his participation, but she had no authority left, no leverage beyond tears, and tears had stopped moving anyone in the ghetto months ago. She held him the night before the first of the 3 operations, and told him his father would have been proud, though they both knew his father would have been horrified, would have locked Jakob in their apartment rather than let him risk his life this way. But his father was dead, and the living made different calculations than the dead would have approved. The first of the final 3 escapes went perfectly, 5 children extracted in less than 2 minutes, the pepper dispersing the dogs so effectively that the guard never even looked toward the grate. The second operation, attempted just 36 hours later, encountered complications when the wind shifted at the critical moment, blowing half the pepper cloud away from the dog's path. Jacob had to use his backup supply, a smaller pouch he carried for emergencies, and the double dose left the animal completely incapacitated, rolling on the ground and howling. The guard panicked, thinking his dog had been poisoned, and called for backup on his radio. Jakob got 4 children through the grate in the chaos, but the increased SS presence meant the 3rd operation, scheduled for 2 nights later, would face unprecedented danger. The resistance leadership met one final time and voted 4-3 to cancel the remaining escape. Jakob, who had no official vote, said he was going anyway, with or without their support, and that the 6 children on the list deserved the same chance the other 47 had received. Marique volunteered to accompany him, as did 2 other resistance members, a teenager named Joseph and a woman named Leah, who had lost her own children in a selection the previous summer. They understood the mathematics had shifted against them, that the SS was actively hunting for the source of the escapes, that this operation would likely end in capture or death. But they also understood something that separated resistance members from survivors. Survivors made rational choices designed to maximize their own odds of seeing liberation. Resistance members made irrational choices designed to ensure that even if they died, something of value would persist beyond them. The 6 children waiting in the pharmacy basement represented that value. And so on a cold March night with fresh snow falling on the ghetto streets, 4 adults descended into the tunnel one last time, carrying children who weighed almost nothing, and hopes that weighed everything. The tunnel felt different that night, colder somehow, though the temperature had not actually changed. Jakob led the group with 3 children on his back, a configuration he had never attempted before, but which the circumstances demanded. The youngest was barely 5 years old, so light with malnutrition that carrying her added almost no weight, and the other 2, twins, aged 8, clung to his shoulders with a desperation that left bruises. Behind him, Leah carried 2 more children, and Isef brought up the rear with the 6th, a girl named Rachel, who had watched her parents dragged from their apartment 3 days earlier, and had not spoken since. The water level in the sewer was higher tonight, reaching almost to Jakob's knees, and the current pulled at their legs with each step, making the journey slower and louder than any previous operation. Above them, the city was unusually active. German trucks rumbling through streets, voices shouting orders in a language that had become the soundtrack of oppression. They reached the grate after 12 minutes of careful movement, and Jakob immediately sensed something wrong in the rhythm overhead. The guard's patrol pattern had changed. Instead of the solitary SS soldier with his dog, there were now 2 guards, their footsteps overlapping in a way that eliminated the predictable pause Jakob had exploited 11 times before. He listened carefully, trying to map the new pattern, trying to find the vulnerable moment that would allow them to surface. But the guards were talking to each other, their conversation casual and relaxed, and their dogs, plural now, moved in coordinated sweeps that covered more ground with greater efficiency. The SS had adapted, had learned from the unexplained incidents where their animals became suddenly useless, and had responded with the systematic thoroughness that made them so terrifyingly effective. Merrick whispered that they should abort, return to the ghetto, try again when they had more intelligence about the new security measures. But Jakob was doing calculations in his head, measuring pepper quantities against dog positions, timing windows against patrol speeds, and he realized something that made his stomach tighten. The new pattern was designed specifically to prevent what he had been doing. Someone, some German analyst studying incident reports, had identified the common factor in all the strange dog behaviors and had restructured the patrols to eliminate the vulnerability. This meant the tunnel route was finished permanently, which meant these 6 children represented the last chance for extraction through this method, which meant aborting was not actually an option because there would be no better opportunity coming later. He made a decision that an 11-year-old should never have to make, a decision that would haunt him for decades if he survived to have decades. He would use all remaining pepper simultaneously, creating a cloud large enough to disable both dogs at once, accepting that this would certainly alert the guards to deliberate sabotage rather than environmental irritants, accepting that the SS response would be immediate and overwhelming, accepting that the 4 adults might not make it back to the ghetto, but the 6 children might make it to the cemetery. Leah understood what he was planning before he explained it, saw him pulling out not just his primary pouch, but also the emergency reserves, and she grabbed his arm hard enough to hurt. She told him there had to be another way, but her voice carried no conviction because they both knew there was not another way. There was only this way, or no way at all. Jakob positioned himself directly beneath the grate and told the others to be ready to push all 6 children through the opening within 10 seconds of him deploying the pepper. 10 seconds before the guards would understand what was happening. 10 seconds before the shooting would start. 10 seconds to save 6 lives at the cost of probably 4 others. He gripped the pepper pouches in both hands, felt the weight of the spice that had become more valuable than gold in the ghetto economy, and waited for the patrol footsteps to reach the optimal position. The children sensed the tension, their small bodies going rigid against the adults who carried them, their breathing shallow and rapid. Above them, the guards' conversation continued, casual and unhurried. 2 men discussing the quality of their dinner rations, while 6 children waited in freezing sewage for a chance at survival, that depended entirely on the timing and courage of a boy who still slept with his mother some nights, when the nightmares became too intense. The guards stopped directly above the grate, their boots visible through the narrow gaps in the metal. So close, Jakob could hear one of them complaining about the cold affecting his trigger finger. The dogs were sniffing methodically, working a grid pattern that would bring them to the grate within perhaps 20 seconds. And once they reached that point, once they detected the human scent concentrated below, the operation would end in gunfire and arrest. Jakob's hands trembled as he prepared to throw the pepper. Not from fear exactly, but from the physiological response to adrenaline his 11-year-old body could not fully control. He took one breath, then another, forcing his mind into the same calm state he had achieved during the previous escapes, that strange place where time seemed to slow, and every detail became crystalline and obvious. The wind was moving east to west at approximately 8 km/h. The dogs were German shepherds, both large males, which meant they would have greater lung capacity and would inhale more pepper per breath. The guards were 3 men apart, which meant the pepper cloud needed to spread wide rather than concentrate deep. He pushed the grate up with his left hand while simultaneously throwing both pepper pouches with his right, a maneuver he had practiced mentally, but never physically attempted. The pouches burst open in midair, releasing perhaps 6 tablespoons of black pepper in a spreading cloud that hung suspended for 1 perfect second before the dogs walked into it. The effect was catastrophic for the animals. Both German shepherds began sneezing violently, pawing at their faces, whining in distress that quickly escalated to panicked yelping. The guards reacted with confusion, yanking leashes, shouting commands the dogs could not possibly obey. While their respiratory systems were being overwhelmed by irritation, Jakob did not wait to see more. He grabbed the first child, one of the 8-year-old twins, and shoved her through the grate opening with enough force that she scraped her arm on the metal edge. The Polish contact was there, hands reaching out, pulling the child into the cemetery shadows. The second twin came next. Then the 5-year-old, then the 2 others Leah had been carrying, all pushed through in a desperate assembly line that took perhaps 8 seconds total. Rachel, the girl who had stopped speaking, was the last, and as Joseph lifted her toward the opening, one of the guards finally processed what was happening. He drew his pistol and fired twice, not at the children, not yet, but at the ground near the grate, warning shots designed to freeze movement and establish control. The sound was deafening in the confined space, and Rachel screamed, the first sound she had made in 3 days. A scream that seemed to contain all the horror of the previous months, compressed into a single expression of terror. Joseph pushed her through anyway, felt the Polish contact grab her, felt the child disappear into whatever life awaited her on the other side. Then the guards' flashlights found the opening. Beams of light cutting through the darkness to illuminate Jakob's face, staring up from the sewer. One guard was yelling into his radio, calling for backup, reporting an escape attempt in progress at the cemetery position. The other had his pistol aimed at the grate, finger on the trigger, and Jacob could see the man's face clearly now. Could see he was young, maybe 22 or 23. Could see the mixture of anger and fear that came from realizing he had been outwitted by children. And Peppa Merrick grabbed Jakob's coat and pulled him away from the opening, dragging him backward into the tunnel, while Leia and Isef moved in the opposite direction, creating multiple targets to divide the guards' attention. More shots fired. Bullets ricocheting off the sewer walls with sparks that briefly illuminated the running figures. They ran through the waist-deep water with abandon, now stealth no longer possible or relevant, splashing and gasping and praying to gods most of them had stopped believing in months ago. Behind them, the guards were calling down into the tunnel, ordering them to stop, threatening execution, but also clearly uncertain about entering the sewer themselves, unwilling to descend into that darkness, where their advantages of weaponry and training meant less than they did on the street. The resistance members reached a junction point where the tunnel split into 3 directions, and Merrick made a quick decision, sending Leah and Joseph down one path while he and Jacob took another. The separation would divide any pursuit, increase the odds that at least some of them would make it back. Jakob's lungs burned. His legs trembled from exhaustion and cold. But he kept moving because stopping meant capture, and capture meant not just death, but torture, interrogation, the revelation of names and locations that would doom everyone else in the resistance network. They emerged from a different access point 2 blocks inside the ghetto boundary, pulling themselves up through a storm drain that deposited them in an alley behind a shuttered bakery. Jakob's entire body shook with cold and shock, his clothes soaked through with sewage, his hands bleeding from where he had scraped them against the tunnel walls during the desperate flight. Marek was in worse condition, a bullet having grazed his shoulder during the escape, blood mixing with the filth coating his coat. They could hear sirens throughout the ghetto now, German voices shouting orders, trucks moving through streets with a speed and purpose that meant the SS was mobilizing a full response. The Pepper operation, which had worked perfectly 11 times, had finally triggered exactly the catastrophic attention the resistance had feared. Within hours, the Nazis would begin systematic searches, looking for anyone connected to the escape attempt, and they would find connections because the ghetto was too small and too monitored for secrets to remain hidden long. Marek told Jakob to go home immediately, to clean himself, to act as normal as possible if the SS came searching. But Jakob knew normal was no longer an option. Knew that his involvement in the resistance had been witnessed by at least 2 guards who had seen his face clearly in their flashlight beams. An 11-year-old boy with distinctive features, dark curly hair, and a scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood accident before the war, identifiable and now hunted. He asked Marek what would happen next, and the older teenager gave him the truth rather than comfort. The resistance would go into emergency protocols, destroying evidence, severing connections, assuming everyone involved in tonight's operation was compromised. The tunnel would be collapsed from inside to prevent the SS from using it to infiltrate deeper into the ghetto. And Jakob, along with Marek, Leah, and Isef, would need to disappear into the ghetto's underground, hiding in spaces prepared for exactly this eventuality. Spaces so concealed that even systematic searches might miss them. The safe house was located beneath a synagogue that had been partially destroyed during the initial ghetto establishment. Its basement accessed through a hidden entrance behind a collapsed section of wall. Marek led Jakob there through back alleys, moving in shadows, avoiding the main streets where SS trucks were now stationed at every intersection. They found Leah already waiting, her face pale with pain from a twisted ankle sustained during the tunnel flight, but alive and functional. Joseph never arrived. They waited 3 hours past the designated rendezvous time, listening to the sounds of the SS search intensifying throughout the ghetto, hearing occasional gunshots that might have been executions or might have been warning shots, unable to know, but fearing the worst. At dawn, a resistance runner brought confirmation. Joseph had been captured near the pharmacy, had been beaten in the street, and had been taken to the SS headquarters for interrogation. The underground space was perhaps 3 mere square, with a ceiling so low adults had to crouch, and no ventilation beyond a single narrow crack that allowed minimal air circulation. 6 other resistance members were already hiding there, making the space impossibly cramped. Bodies pressed against each other in a configuration that eliminated any concept of personal space or dignity. They had supplies for perhaps 4 days, water and dried bread mostly, rationed carefully because no one knew how long the SS response would continue. Jakob sat in a corner, his back against the cold stone wall, and tried to process what had happened. 6 children had escaped, 6 lives saved, but at what cost? Isef was being tortured, probably revealing information even as Jacob sat there helpless. The tunnel route was burned, unusable for any future operations, and the SS now knew that someone inside the ghetto had been systematically undermining their security, which would lead to increased surveillance, harsher reprisals, collective punishments designed to terrify the population into submission. An older resistance member, a man named Hirsch, who had been a lawyer before the war, tried to offer perspective. He told Jacob that 53 children total had escaped using the Pepper method. 53 lives that would not end in Treblinka's gas chambers. 53 futures that might include survival until liberation. He said this as if it were mathematics, as if the equation balanced somehow. But Jacob understood what Hirsch was trying not to say. The operation was over. The Pepper Boy brief career as a resistance operative had ended in the worst possible way, with exposure and casualties, and a tactical victory that felt indistinguishable from defeat. Above them, boots marched through the synagogue ruins, German voices calling out search patterns, and Jakob pressed his face against his knees and tried to make himself smaller, tried to become invisible, tried to transform into someone who had never thrown pepper at dogs, or pushed children through sewer grates, or made decisions that an 11-year-old should never have to make. They stayed in the underground space for 6 days, not 4, because the SS response was more thorough than anyone had anticipated. The Germans established checkpoints at every ghetto intersection, demanded papers from anyone moving between buildings, and conducted apartment-by-apartment searches, looking for evidence of resistance activity. On the 3rd day, they found the collapsed tunnel entrance and brought in engineers to map the entire sewer system, documenting every possible escape route with German precision. On the 4th day, they executed 32 people in the ghetto square, randomly selected from the apartment blocks nearest the pharmacy. Collective punishment designed to terrorize the population into betraying anyone connected to the escapes. Jakob listened to the gunshots from underground, counted them, knew that 32 families were being destroyed because of decisions he had participated in making, and felt something inside him calcify into a hardness that would never fully soften again. Joseph broke under interrogation on the 5th day, not because he was weak, but because the SS methods were scientifically designed to break anyone eventually. He gave them 3 names, all of people already dead or already captured, protecting the operational resistance, but confirming that an organized network existed. The Nazis responded by increasing the deportation quotas, taking an additional 500 people to Treblinka ahead of schedule, a deliberate escalation meant to demonstrate that resistance would be punished exponentially. The ghetto population received the message clearly. Several families who had donated pepper to the escape operations began spreading rumors that they had been deceived, that they had not known what the spice would be used for. Desperate attempts at self-preservation that fooled no one, but had to be attempted anyway. The mathematics of survival in the ghetto had always been brutal, but now they became impossible, an equation with no solutions that still demanded constant recalculation. When Jacob finally emerged from the safe house on the 7th day, the ghetto had transformed into something even more oppressive than before. The SS had installed additional guard towers, increased dog patrols to every hour instead of every 2 hours, and posted notices warning that any further escape attempts would result in the liquidation of entire apartment buildings. His mother was waiting in their apartment, her face showing a mixture of relief and anger and exhaustion that made her look decades older than her 34 years. She did not ask where he had been because she already knew, did not lecture him about the danger because the danger was self-evident, did not cry because tears were a luxury the ghetto could no longer afford. She simply pulled him into an embrace that lasted perhaps 10 seconds, then released him and returned to her work preparing the evening's watery soup as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Jakob's sister was gone, safely hidden in a Catholic orphanage on the Aryan side under a Polish name, and her absence filled the apartment like a presence rather than a void. The other children who had escaped through the pepper operations were scattered across Warsaw and beyond, their Jewish identities erased, their survival dependent on maintaining false papers and false stories until the war ended. If the war ended in April of 1943, that outcome was far from certain. The German war machine still dominating Europe, the Allied forces still years away from liberating Poland. Jakob tried to return to some semblance of normal life, attending the ghetto school when it was open, helping his mother with her factory work when it was not, but normal was a concept that no longer applied to his existence. The resistance continued operating but with different methods. Abandoning the smuggling operations in favor of preparing for armed uprising, stockpiling weapons acquired through bribes and theft, training fighters for a confrontation everyone knew would be suicidal, but necessary. Merrick approached Jakob one night and asked if he wanted to participate in the new phase of resistance. But Jakob declined, not because he lacked courage, but because he understood something fundamental about his role in the war. He was 11 years old, would turn 12 in 2 months if he survived that long, and his contribution had been specific and unique, and now complete. The pepper technique had worked until it stopped working, had saved 53 children until it endangered hundreds more, and now it was over. He told Merrick he needed to focus on keeping himself and his mother alive until his sister could be reunited with them after liberation. A goal that seemed fantastical but was the only thing preventing complete despair. Jakob survived the Warsaw Ghetto uprising that erupted 3 weeks later in April of 1943, though survival is perhaps too generous a word for what he experienced. He hid in basements while the SS systematically burned the ghetto building by building, watched flames consume everything that had been his childhood, breathed smoke so thick it turned day into perpetual twilight. His mother was killed on the 6th day of the uprising, shot while trying to reach a water source during a brief ceasefire that the Germans violated without hesitation. Jakob was captured on the 11th day and sent to Maiden concentration camp, where his age and small size ironically became advantages, making him useful for tasks adult prisoners could not perform. He survived Maiden, survived a death march in 1945, survived liberation by Soviet forces who arrived too late to save most, but just in time to save him. After the war, he spent 2 years searching for his sister through the chaos of displaced persons camps and orphanage records, following leads that went nowhere, interviewing nuns who remembered a girl matching her description, but could not say what had become of her. He found her in 1947, living with a Polish family in Ków, under the name Maria Kowalska, speaking fluent Polish and almost no Yiddish. Her memories of the ghetto fragmented and dreamlike. She did not recognize him immediately, 7 years old when they separated, 9 when they reunited. She had constructed a new identity to survive, and reclaiming her original self proved more complicated than either of them anticipated. They immigrated to America in 1949, settled in New York, and tried to build lives from the fragments the war had left them. His sister eventually married, had children, lived until 2012 without ever fully discussing what she remembered from the night she crawled through a sewer grate, while her 11-year-old brother threw pepper at dogs. Jacob himself never married, never had children of his own, worked as a mechanic in Brooklyn for 43 years, and spoke about his resistance activities only once in a video testimony recorded for the Shaw Foundation in 1998. The interviewer asked him how many children he helped save, and he answered 53 with the same precision he had used to count guard footsteps in 1943. The interviewer called him a hero, and Jakob rejected the term, immediately explaining that heroes were people who had choices and chose bravely while he had been a child in impossible circumstances, making calculations where every option included death. He said the real heroes were people like Joseph, who endured torture without betraying the network, or his mother who made the decision to send her daughter into darkness with only hope as a guarantee. The testimony was archived, catalogued, and largely forgotten. 1. Story among thousands, remarkable only in its details about pepper and dogs, and a technique so simple it seemed impossible. But here is what matters. What the official histories often miss. 53 children survived the Warsaw Ghetto because an 11-year-old boy noticed that German shepherds sneezed when exposed to black pepper, and because he had the courage to act on that observation when every adult around him was paralyzed by despair. Those 53 children became adults, had their own children, their own grandchildren. The mathematics of survival is generational. Today there are approximately 230 descendants of those 53 children living across 4 continents. People who exist because a child refused to accept that the Nazi machinery of death was perfect. People whose lives are a direct rebuke to the ideology that tried to exterminate them. Most of them do not know the story of the Pepper Boy. Most of them do not know that their existence traces back to a desperate improvisation in a Warsaw sewer. But their presence in the world is his legacy, more permanent than any monument, more meaningful than any medal he never received. The Warsaw Ghetto was liquidated in May of 1943. Approximately 300,000 Jews were murdered in Treblinka or killed during the uprising. The tunnel Jakob used was discovered and sealed by the SS, documented in German records as a security breach that was successfully eliminated. But 6 children escaped through that tunnel on its final operation, and 47 escaped before that. And every single one of those escapes was a victory that the Nazis could never reverse. A life saved that echoed forward through time in ways the architects of genocide never anticipated. This is the story they did not teach you in school. This is the truth that almost disappeared into the void, where so many other truths were deliberately buried. An 11-year-old boy with black pepper and perfect timing, saving children one sewer grate at a time, proving that even in humanity's darkest hour, courage could be measured in something as simple as a household spice and the refusal to surrender poop.